Another scandalously brief introduction. Suhail Malik of Goldsmiths University has, to me personally, been a very important partner in conversation over recent years in a number of different settings on topics such as class structures in the art world, curatorial practices, and a number of other art education in particular. I know that he's currently working on a book on a philosophy of American power. I'm very happy that he's joining us today. Thanks, Suhail. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I face three disadvantages. Firstly, some preliminary announcements. Thank you to Luma Foundation and to Bart for being here. It's an honor. I have three disadvantages presenting this paper. One, it's a very warm Sunday afternoon, which is difficult, and you've just had lunch, which makes my task even harder. Secondly, the paper's almost entirely theoretical, so it may be of a different tenor to what you've heard so far. And thirdly, I have a sort of lulling voice. So the destiny of my paper is undoubtedly your relaxed post-lunch Sunday sleep, but I'll try and get past all of that. Now, it's a truism, it's a fact, that contemporary art today is a global undertaking. I think this development is no accident. It's not only a pragmatic result, this globalization, it's not only a pragmatic result of contemporary art's attractive combination of intimacy, cleverness, vendability, the ease of handling and shipping, its speed of consumption, the importance of the social milieu, such as here, to its intellectual, social, and monetary transactions, the relatively tight circuit of ownership, and factors like this. In addition to these practical conveniences, contemporary art works well as a culture of globalization because its addressee, the one who is addressed by the art, is an indeterminate subject, and that's the central claim of the paper. The addressee of contemporary art is indeterminate. And we know this better, this indeterminacy, we know it better from the angle of contemporary art's indeterminate address. Contemporary art can be anything, allegedly. Institutionally it's not, but allegedly, theoretically it can be. It's without genre, it's non-disciplinary, thematically and materially promiscuous, and so on. Unlike products of the spectacle, contemporary art leaves space and time for its viewer. Its communications are non-direct or incomplete. The addressee makes her or his own way through the art, which is abstract enough, playful enough, unspecific enough for the addressee to have to interpret it as she or he can in an appealing combination of affective and intellectual productive receptivity. Sometimes this productive receptivity is assisted by the vendor, the one who sells the work, and sometimes it's assisted by helpful literature in the catalogue, which kind of guides you without being too instructive about what might be important around the work. Now, this interpretive labor generates a sense of intimacy and gain for the addressee, the one who is addressed by the work. And this intimacy and gain means that the addressee is no longer than just subject to a commodity indifferent to them, but proximate to the art. The addressee is proximate to the art. It's the art's confidant. Amongst other similar traits, all of this amounts to the legendary non-didactic work that is the reigning paradigm of contemporary art. What is crucial for contemporary art as a global fact is that its relative indeterminacy is not just the art itself, but also the indeterminacy of its addressee. Okay, it's not just that the qualities of contemporary art, the sort of expectations that it fulfills as an artwork, the indeterminacy just isn't to do with that, but the addressee, the one who is doing the interpretation of the contemporary art, that person is also indeterminate. Put it another way, the addressee of contemporary art can, in principle, maybe not in fact, but in principle, can be anyone. Not just a sociological anyone who is known through their particularities, a he or a she, from this or that part of the planet, this or that race, if that's still a category, this or that generation, with or this or that knowledge about art. But more crucially, that the addressee is an indefinite anyone. Here is a subject who has no particular or prescribed determinations other than the capacity and liberty to make something of the artwork, including its rejection or dislike. To do so equally to everyone else and to the work itself, and whose determinations of the art are each time particular. Your interpretation is your own, and it's expected to be. in contemporary art. The subject cannot be positioned or prescribed in advance without interfering or undermining the very indeterminacy of the art itself. Contemporary art's indeterminacy is not a lack or evasion of responsibility to its addressee. Rather, it's the condition for the surfeit of the same, the excess, its universality. The addressee of contemporary art, as an indefinite anyone, is a universal addressee. That every addressee's productive interpretation is equal in rights to everyone else's. Now, as much as this indeterminacy is the condition for its appreciation, for contemporary art's appreciation, for it to fulfill the conventions of contemporary art, it's also, this indeterminacy is also the condition for art circulation and distribution on a global circuit in which it is presented as having legitimacy and salience everywhere. The indeterminacy of contemporary art permits a kind of practical universalism. It's a anxious phrase, but I'll use it. A kind of practical universalism for which art's globalized distribution is a sociological proxy. Now, I think three correlates can be quickly identified. There are many other consequences to this notion of contemporary art, but I want to address three which are pertinent to this conference. Firstly, democracy. The combination of individual particularized interpretation predicated on an indefinite, which is to say an unauthorized universality, offers a model of democratic engagement. Such a democracy is formal with regard to who or what it may involve, because it can be anyone and maybe anything. So it's a formal determination of what that democracy would involve. Yet it's particular, at least relatively constrained in terms of the material and thematic presentation of the art itself. Okay? So one doesn't see simply anything when one looks at an artwork. It's a relatively constrained encounter, the constraints being offered by what the artwork is, but importantly, not by who the addressee of the artwork is. Okay? So, and I think that's a sort of a kind of model for democracy. What's important, what I'm trying to stress, is that it's a formalism. The second correlate to this characterization of contemporary art is humanism. The commonality or universality of contemporary art is not at all predicated on specific virtues of art, such as its embodying or being instructive ideals, sentiment, beauty, and so on, which was a previous art's consolation of a humanism that presumed a definite sense of human virtue and its cosmic primacy, which is essentially what I understand humanism to be, that the human is at the center of the cosmos. Remy Brague has an interesting book on Aristotle where he points out that in classical and I guess up to medieval times, the center of the universe was a dumping ground, a garbage heap. So actually humanism wasn't necessarily about the superiority of the human, but it's a basement in front of God's creation. But the point here is that art, at a certain type of art, certainly not contemporary art, was a kind of consolation to this cosmic primacy of the human. If contemporary art, by contrast, puts its putatively human addressee to the forefront, it constructs an at once singular and generic subject. You, whoever you are the addressee of this art. And that's as far as the determination of the artwork goes. You, whoever you are. What do you make of me? I think that's the core request of contemporary art. And it constructs this singular and generic subject on the basis of having no specific virtue other than the invitation to make what you will of the art within the parameters it sets up. In its indeterminacy, contemporary art constructs a practical universalism that, contrary to previous humanisms, supposes nothing of its addressee. You need have no virtues, you need have no superiority or inferiority or any other claims. Okay? Advancing nothing specific other than interpretive promiscuity, there is what I would call a constructed second humanism, in a way that is similar as analogy to second nature that is formed through habit or training. The second here acknowledging constructedness or production rather than a spontaneous supposition. The third corollary to this indeterminacy of contemporary art is photography. As long ago as 1927, Siegfried Kracauer, the German journalist, essentially, a different order of journalism than today, but still a journalist, as long as Sigurd Krakauer complained that distinct to memories grasping things on the basis of their significance, photography grasps what is given only as part of the space-time continuum, as he calls it. From the perspective of memory, the proliferation and ubiquity of photography is what he calls a jumble of meaningless fragments, consisting partly, as he says, partly of garbage. He says, photography buries a person's history as if under a layer of snow. Now, if that layer has today turned into the flood of Flickr, Tumblr, YouTube, and so on, that Krakauer warns sweeps away the dams of memory, the blizzard of he says, the blizzard of photographs betraying an indifference towards what things mean. In that context, contemporary art's interpretive intimacy restores something like that significance, because it's an intimacy and therefore a relation of significance, even for photography itself, in this blizzard of insignificance. Coupled to its addressee's interpretive construction, contemporary art does not presume meaning or significance where there is none, as a recuperative humanism might demand, but asks for its each time particular generation. So the claim is that with contemporary art, photography regains significance, not because of what the photograph is, because it's a photograph in the flood of other images, but because of the interpretive task it sets the viewer. Okay? And that's where the relationship of intimacy is generated, and that produces significance where previously there is none, or very little. Even as some art capitalizes upon the loss of significance and meaning, the indifferent space-time continuum of the photographic image regains significance in contemporary art through contemporary art's indeterminate presentation. The kinds of attention, for example, paid to the personal snapshot, the documentary photograph, the advertising image on the one side, can be distinguished from those of the art image on the other, even if the two have putatively the same content. So these three consequences, democracy, humanism, photography, which, as I'm saying, I'm putting forward simply as by way of addressing the themes of this conference. These three consequences of contemporary art's indeterminacy are tied together inextricably. The second humanism of its practical universalism has the appealing form of a democratic proliferation of particularized interpretations that require the construction, communication, and reflection of significance without prescription or horizon. The large numbers of people going into contemporary art galleries in order to produce their own interpretations is a sort of a model for contemporary creative economy democracies. Okay, so that's the sort of logic that's around here. The addressee of photography's objective space-time continuum of things that just happens, shit happens, photography records that shit happens. The addressee of photography's objective space-time continuum can recuperate significance from and for that otherwise indifferent continuum, but only insofar as something of it remains indeterminate, so long, that is, that it leaves some space for its open subjective appreciation. I think probably the difference between seeing, let me think, someone like Robert Capra's photographs as a journalist and then seeing them in an art museum, that there's a different undertaking involved in the two cases. Okay, or the transfer of Stephen Mizell's photographs from Vogue to an art gallery to a museum. There's a different task of looking. In a way, I would claim that the photographs, although they're the same photographs, become more indeterminate and presume more of their viewer as a productive interpreter in the art space than they do in the magazine space. Because the magazine space, you just flick through the images. Yeah. That's not the expectation of the art space. Clearly not. The precepts and appeal of such a construction of the second humanism, which is our democracy, which is the indeterminacy of contemporary art. The precepts and appeal of such a construction are clear. A respect for the indeterminate addressee, the expectation of a liberty of meaning-making and significance, interpretive equality, the indifference to sociological determination. Art doesn't care who you are. The opportunity and recuperation of self-determined significance for the subject, which we could call autonomy, and so on. If these are partly therapeutic consolations for a subject subordinated to a world indifferent to them, which is one version of globalization, it is because they accord with the primary ends of an Enlightenment schema of practices of human dignity, now coded as human rights. And here I'd refer to Bassam's claims in his paper, although I think, well, we maybe discuss that later on. Now, this bond or characterization of contemporary art as a consolation, because it sort of recuperates something of human rights, seems at once right and wrong, and it has to be both. As with any other doctrine, explicit allegiance to human rights or advocacy of it in contemporary art would foreclose the indeterminacy of contemporary art and make it instead a dogmatic or prescriptive production, prescribing precisely the interpretive task, which I'm claiming is the core of contemporary art. Its characterization, its regulating regime. Yet it's this indeterminacy, which prescribes us being doctrinaire about human rights in contemporary art, it's this indeterminacy that tips contemporary art towards the kind of democratic practices satisfying human rights expectations by default. It's not then that human rights are the content of contemporary art, but its effect and appeal, a political tendency that is met so long as it does not appear as a fact in it. Okay? And it's this complicated scenario I want to sketch out. Enacted by virtue of not being explicitly presented, this is a complex politics. Whether this is just a shortcoming of contemporary art with regard to a more fulsome and definite politics, as is often wished for, or a necessary condition and limitation of contemporary art, can, I think, be clarified by taking a detour through the instructive disputes in humanitarianism since the mid-1990s, in particular the position taken by Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, known in America as Doctors Without Borders. Launched in protest against the neutrality requirements supposed by the Red Cross and the famine relief during the Biafra War in the late 1960s, principles, the neutrality principles being that the NGOs require, that wishes to provide humanitarian relief to the people whose lives are being destroyed by the conflict, that the NGO obtains permission from all sides for their activity in the field and to abstain from taking any sides, even when one party is clearly a violator or perpetrator and the other its victim. That's the neutrality principle that the Red Cross insists on as a condition of its operation. So its own operations aren't understood to be part of a military strategy on either side. Contrast to this, MSF distinguished itself from other humanitarian agencies by its insistence that témoignage, or bearing witness, is a key element for attaining the goals of humanitarian assistance. To quote some MSF functionaries, they say that since MSF is only, as they say, accountable to international civil society and humanitarian principles rather than state-sponsored institutions, public appeals are primary in its combating indifference to the plights of populations and to signal the need for a local and international responsibility to uphold basic humanitarian and human rights principles. This principal position has been important to uphold since the 1970s, when other activist humanitarian organizations looked to address the causes of the famines and other threats to basic conditions that humanitarian aid sought only to relieve. In doing so, humanitarian NGOs went from providing needs-based aid, as it's called, to advocacy work for at-risk populations whose interests were formulated in terms of promulgating their human rights in order to attain peace, security, and development, the universality of these rights, supporting the purported impartiality of what's then called rights-based interventions. The scenario is that humanitarian agencies either go in to give relief to a humanitarian emergency, or they say, well, we need to address the causes for these humanitarian emergencies, and for that we need to build civil societies, and that's usually tasked as a commitment to human rights. And that's a different type of humanitarian intervention called rights-based intervention. Now, what happened in this shift, which took place from the 1970s onwards, is a shift from neutrality to impartiality. And this is common across the humanitarian sector, up to and including the United Nations with its failures in Srebrenica and Rwanda. Impartiality is now favored as a term, signaling that humanitarian organizations continue to seek no favor with any combatant, which is the neutrality condition, but will act to provide the assistance they deem necessary, whether or not agreement has been reached with the local parties as neutrality requires, okay? So neutrality waits until it's got permission from everyone before it intervenes. Impartiality says, we don't go with either side, but we will act because we must act. We don't seek permission in order to act. We intervene. It's been, however, the impartiality of rights-based humanitarianism that has provided an attractive, morally organized stance for nation-states to adapt for aid and foreign policy, so long as it doesn't interfere with the interests of those states. More pointedly, and to come back to the substance of MSF's stance, it enables humanitarian development of civil societies and rights-based aid to be conjoined to governments claiming to foster the same values, sometimes under the title of the responsibility to protect. This is, of course, the problems with the Iraq and Afghanistan wars over the 2000s, that they were claimed to be, in some ways, rights-based interventions, as well as, obviously, nation-state interests and exploitations. Okay? Now, this integration between humanitarian assistance of the rights-based kind and nation-state power, this is called integration in the literature. This is justified by the humanitarian agencies on the grounds that such state-led actions support their own impartial ambitions for right-based interventions. Okay? So a lot of these humanitarian agencies interested in rights-based interventions take a lot of money from state bodies, usually aid ministries or foreign state departments, in order to promote their own work, and the two sort of work convergently to produce civil societies across the world, where it's claimed there aren't already some. Now, recognizing that states supporting rights-based intervention are the core Western liberal internationally dominant countries, the moral claims made for and upon human rights then flip into a modified form of its countermanding realpolitik formulation, that might makes not right, but might makes rights, which is a problem for human rights doctrines, because it should not be about might. Objecting to this integration with state power as a breach of its humanitarianism's necessary impartiality, MFS revised its position over the 2000s. For example, the International Activity Report of 2005 takes a clear distance from any human rights advocacy. It says, MSF seeks to bear witness to the fate of populations as precisely as possible, not as defenders of human rights, but simply as direct witnesses to the suffering of the sick and injured, and to the stolen dignity of so many men, women, and children all over the world. Peace, democracy, economic development, and justice are the underlying issues in, or the backdrop to, many dramas with humanitarian consequences, but they are not our fights. While impartiality for rights-based humanitarianism enables its integration with moral or ethical state policy initiatives, as they're called, for needs-based humanitarianism, impartiality amounts to a principled appeal to civil society and independence from national or international state institutions. For MSF, impartiality upholds the principle of universality for the alleviation of suffering. And this is a partial return to Red Cross neutrality principles, and it is consistent for MSF with the principle of témoignage as a task of civil society, only of civil society. Okay? That's the characterization of the témoignage issue for MSF. Yet, it seems to me that this appeal to civil society, the other side of which is MSF's claim that its interest is only civilians left over from the politics of any particular conflict, I think this appeal to civil society is tendentious. While it looks to civil society and publicity to pressurize regimes causing humanitarian crises, it supposes precisely that there is a civil society, and a civil society constituted independently of state institutions with the freedom of speech, equality of actors, communicational legitimacy, and so on, all of which are no less what rights-based humanitarianism also pins its ambitions on, understanding very well on its part that the independence of human rights claims from state determination is crucial for its impartiality and no less demonstrates the universality of those claims. Okay? So my claim is that MSF's appeal to civil society is exactly the same appeal coded otherwise than the ones that rights-based humanitarianism makes, apart from rights-based humanitarianism says we must go through the state in order to construct civil societies. Both of them appeal to civil society as the condition for rights, or as the location, the proper location in which rights are enacted, claimed and enacted. Furthermore, témoignage can only be an effective policy for MSF if it appeals to justice, dignity, freedom from want and depredation, all of which are regular claims made by advocates of rights-based humanitarianism. Témoignage wouldn't make much sense as an appeal if the understanding was that you would say, we want witnesses to show what's happening in this part of the world, and the expectation was, so what? Who cares? Who gives a crap? That's not the assumption of témoignage. The assumption is that you bear witness, and there is a response which is effective and acts in the names of the kinds of rights that I think are meant to be embodied by civil society. So, in other words, through témoignage, MSF mediates its politics through the neutrality of civil society in order to extricate its moral condition from its inevitably political conditions and ramifications. Political, because they posit judgments of where to draw the line between an appeal to civil society and identification with the state interests, which is a political judgment. It revises policy, which is to do with politics, in the light of changing humanitarian environment. It makes distinctive its version of impartiality and so on. I'll need 5 more minutes than I have, if that's okay. I need 10 more minutes altogether. Okay. The political logic here is this. Humanitarian impartiality gains universal traction the more it dissociates itself from explicitly prescribing the human rights that it relies upon for its operational strategic implementation. Okay, it's quite a complicated logic. I'll repeat it. Well, I'll say it in tighter formulation. The more explicitly determined the practical implementation of human rights, the less universal and more political, tendentious is their operationalization. Or put the other way, the precepts of humanitarianism as a practical universalism of human rights have to remain partially indeterminate in its practical implementation for them to be more fully universally implemented. And here, I think it'd be interesting to return to Ariella Ozzuli's claim about the declarative exhibition or the declarative artwork. It seems to me that the practical universalism of human rights depends upon it not being explicitly declared. Okay? That there's a withdrawal, that it remains partially indeterminate in order for a more universal practical implementation. Now, so the mediation of its politics, of MSF's politics, but similar kinds of claims, the mediation of its politics through civil society and the civilians for whom it provides relief separates the too close and problematic identification of the fact of humanitarian identification from its principles, paradoxically, because of this separation, permitting its more universal practical implementation. And I would like to call this reliance on and supposition of civil society as marking this politics of impartiality to be one of civility. Okay? Civility does not then mean or just mean politeness and good manners, although it's certainly that. It's a politics that takes a principled, if not factual, distance from politics promulgated through state institutions. Okay? So civility is a politics that takes a principled distance from politics promulgated through state institutions, and I think it's exactly what MSF does in its appeal for témoignage through civil society. It is a politics, it's claimed to be a morality, by taking its distance from state politics and appealing to civil society. Civility, then, is not a limitation of needs or rights-based humanitarianism as a practice in politics, but intrinsic to human rights principles as such. It constitutes them as rights, not as facts. Principles that can be claimed and mobilized by anyone, state powers included, and here I take distance from a cynicism of state powers claiming human rights in the names of their own interventions. As rights, they can be claimed and mobilized by anyone with equal legitimacy and without belong definitively in one time or place or sociological identity. Civility is the condition and logic of human rights' practical universalism. Human rights are operationalized as universal precepts when they remain relatively indeterminate in humanitarian intervention, when impartiality remains attached to neutrality rather than declared universality. Indeed, the humanitarian and human rights NGOs that rely upon and consolidate civil society as their operational condition in the name of needs-based humanitarianism, or as their aim for rights-based humanitarianism, are themselves outstanding examples of civility. It seems to me humanitarian NGOs are kind of perfect exemplars of civility. And I think that's part of the political problem of NGOs. That's the detour through the humanitarian formulation of the mobilization of rights more effectively through their indeterminacy, less effectively through the explicit declaration. Returning then to the question of the complex politics of contemporary art's own allegiances to human rights precepts, this logic of civility, which I've just outlined, suggests that in fact contemporary art's requisite indeterminacy, that is no less the requirement for human rights to be realized to their maximal universal extent. Okay, so I'm abstracting this logic from humanitarianism and saying that the indeterminacy of human rights manifests precisely this logic of civility. I'll explain what I mean by that in the coming minutes. What brings art into the orbit of human rights precepts, not necessarily human rights themselves, but human rights precepts, is not that they're explicitly and fully avowed or declared. We've seen that they can't be for them still to be in contemporary art. It's not that they're explicitly and fully avowed or declared in art, but precisely that they are not. Okay? This is not directly to identify humanitarian impartiality with contemporary art's indeterminacy, nor is it to equate humanitarianism and its commendable work in alleviating terrible depredations with contemporary art, which certainly doesn't do that, much though some people would wish that it did. More modestly, but I think more effectively for this reason, art's indeterminacy requires impartiality with regard not only to its addressee, but also, as noted, to human rights precepts themselves. Okay? An indeterminacy, not just you, whoever you are, but an indeterminacy around the human rights stuff. And you can probably sense that where I'm moving to say it's this indeterminacy with human rights, then in fact fulfills the human rights claims all the more effectively for that reason. And it's by virtue of this indeterminacy impartiality coupling that its practical universalism, contemporary art's practical universalism, doubles civic neutrality with that of a generic singularity, practically positing a neutrality universality tendentially organized as a human rights politics. Okay? So this you, whoever you are, of contemporary art gets doubled or coupled to the civic neutrality of art itself and also of human rights, and that produces a kind of tendential notion of contemporary art as fulfilling human rights politics. It's a praxis, contemporary arts then is a praxis of neutrality realized on scales that are simultaneously microscopic, the always particular generation of the interpretive production it requires, this person doing their own private interpretive labor in front of an artwork at this gallery or that museum is enacting human rights by virtue of that interpretation, the liberty of it, its equality to every other person's interpretation, and so on and so forth, okay? It's this practice of neutrality is microscopic. It's to do with that very, very atomized almost level of implementation. And it's also vast, the universality of its second humanism. In its civility, contemporary art keeps a distance from human rights precepts in fact, and by virtue of that, instantiates those precepts as a practical universalism. This is a moral political consolation offered by contemporary art today. The interpretive requirement core to its aesthetic, intellectual, and commercial adventure, because of its indeterminacy, is a politics of neutrality, conveniently codified for this reason as a moral undertaking. In its interpretive requirement, contemporary art organizes a fact of human rights. It's a realization of the moral politics of human rights, neutral, which is to say impartial and indeterminate, as to whether it is promoted and supported in regimes with problematic human rights records. And are there any today that don't have problematic human rights records? Even Sweden. Indifferent to whether it's then happening in those kinds of states, or whether one usually thinks of China or the MENA region and so on and so forth as places where there's a proliferation of contemporary rights, terrible authoritarian governments and so on, and there's a kind of claim about some diffuse politicality of contemporary art happening in those regions. It's not quite clear how to articulate that claim, but I would suggest that it's a diffuse human rights claim. But also, it's indifferent as to whether it happens whether human rights, democratic interests are formally hegemonic as they are in the major world powers. So it can happen in capitalist, liberal democracies, and there's still a human rights claim, and there's a kind of indifference as to whether art is taking place in the authoritarian regimes or the sort of Western dominant powers. Contemporary art, in any case, enacts a kind of témoignage, not to depredation, as with MSF, but of human rights. Okay, my central claim is contemporary art is a témoignage of human rights. So by way of conclusion, I have 2 minutes. I think I can maybe just go a little bit longer, maybe not the full 5. By way of conclusion, we can return then to the 3 implicated corollaries of contemporary art's democratic venture. Firstly, democracy itself. The critique of formalism, which is a kind of Marxian critique about democracy, that it's simply formal, doesn't take into account that democracy is organized in and by class interests. For Marx, the bourgeoisie, today a transnational ruling elite. The critique of formalism restates the impartiality, indeterminacy conditions of human rights civility, but does so from the outside, chastising it for not having substantial and positive content for its determinations. Who is the democracy for? Okay, that's the kind of critique. But this, I think, is to misapprehend the operations of civility as having specific content or not, rather than the necessary indeterminacy, impartiality, the neutrality of a claim typical of rights. The latter, the rights claims, is the realization of a state and even class-independent politics called civility. That is no less a definite praxis, a kind of neutrality politics, which, by reason of this neutrality, gains the extension of a practical universalism. Okay? So I think that civility is a formulation of, it's an instantiation of democracy, which is necessarily formal, but for that reason is a definite practice. And I think that gets us out of the kind of now rather hoary, I mean with an H-O-A rather than a W-H, a rather hoary kind of Marxist critique of liberal democracies. Okay, so that's the reclamation of democracy in terms of the civility argument. Secondly, humanism. The morality of human rights warrants the legitimacy as a civic praxis, but they also draw legal support from established superstate conventions and multilateral treaties consequent to the 1948 United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In this, human rights advocacy surpasses the terms of both positivist legal theory, which bases legality on the juridical codifications and says that's all the law is, just its codifications, but rights can't be subordinated or captured by those kinds of codifications because they're rights, not laws. And it also surpasses natural law rights theories as a basis for human rights and the kind of attendant humanisms that are involved in natural law. Okay. What's going on with human rights advocacy is rather, I think, again, a constructed second humanism, a practical humanism instantiated by the diverse range of juridical activism, humanitarian intervention, state and NGO advocacy, and so on. And I would say contemporary art too. Contemporary art's indeterminate addressee realizes the formalism of human rights second humanism as pertaining not to a fictive legal subject, which is what human rights usually is organized through. For contemporary art, the second humanism is not about the fictive legal subject, but also to a singular generic subject it constructs, you, whoever you are. That is, contemporary art, in its second humanism, offers a practical term for the otherwise fictive legal subject of human rights precepts. Combined in the doubling of these second humanisms, this is a case where 2 + 2 continues to equal 2. It's still a second humanism. The subject of civility is in contemporary art, in fact, juridico-aesthetically constituted, and inextricably so, inextricably juridico-aesthetic. And then thirdly, photography. If photography's indifference to its subject matter and the photographer flattens significance for its human subject into what Krakauer called the unorganized heap of the spatio-temporal continuum, that neutralization is at once photography's impartial objectivity, as it is the condition for its mobilization as a civil endeavor, thanks to contemporary art's exporting of its interpretive indeterminacy into the objective world constituted by photography. So with photography and contemporary art, its objectivity becomes subject to this interpretive work, which I'm claiming is this sort of civil endeavor. Okay, and then there's a way in which civility enters the objective realm. And here I'd refer to the presentations of A.L. Weisman yesterday, I think around the politics of forensics. Treated in terms assumed by contemporary art, photography's objective neutrality can be recoded as a neutrality politics. Here, to refer to Ariele Azzurri's fundamental book, here is a civil photography per se, core to whatever pleasure or satisfaction of depredation or debasement or combination of these it captures. The combination, because the combination is what proliferates through the web. It's called entertainment. As before, these three determinations of civility are inextricable, and now I'll conclude. Its politics are those of a democracy constituted and organized more effectively through juridico-aesthetic channels than state institutions. The interest in art as a politics is a way of thinking of politics outside of state institutions, but I think juridico-aesthetically, and therefore I think it's a politics of civility. The formalism of its second humanism evacuates any specific determination of its subject or referent, extending the civility into the objective indifference itself through photography and its offshoots. We have a civility of objects, not just of subjects. In this, reality is redifferentiated as a juridico-aesthetic construction, correlative to an indeterminate, impartial subject, enabling civility to be extended past the humanity that is the putative referent of human rights to the entirety of the space-time continuum that photography presents, an extension of civility, to use Krakau's terms, an extension of civility to the garbage of history. Thank you.